Hey, I'm Blake Smith.
And I'm Matt King.
And we are the Video Island Podcast.
That's right. And on this episode, we're going to be talking about some of our experiences, along with some tips and tricks with directing on-screen talent.
All right, so today I want to talk to you about working with on-camera talent.
Yes.
You know, we work with, all types of people who are on camera, or when they're on camera, whether, it's like a CEO, or it could be, a customer, or it could just be a friend, whoever it be. And they all vary in experience on camera. Some of them could be super confident and, one take wonders, but then you also have the people who are just super nervous, very uncomfortable, got the shakes, and as we like to say, they're deer in the headlights because they're just like, ah. Yeah. And, you even have those people who, are so good at talking in front of crowds of people, 1,000 people, doesn't even affect them, but put them in front of a camera, and they don't even know what to do. And, but at the same time, it's that awkwardness, right, of talking to a machine opposed to like what we're doing right now of talking to one another, right?
That's right.
So I guess we could just dive right into it. And I guess before talking about the talent specifically and the various types that, we work with and what our viewers and listeners will be working with, what do you do for yourself to prep to working with these on-screen talents?
Yeah, so for me, going into any production, I'll obviously prepare to, by looking at if there's a script, I'll take a look over it and obviously meet with the appropriate people, maybe the script writers, things like that. Anybody else that was involved that's more of an expert in the subject matter. If I feel that I need that, I'll make sure I'll prepare and get some more insight from them to make sure that I know the subject matter that I'm doing the production on, enough that if something comes up, I can kind of alternate things on the fly and still feel comfortable that I know what I'm talking about, mixed with, just kind of getting an idea of who I'm working with during the production. We do a lot of our productions at our office with in-house employees. Yeah. So you obviously have the large majority of them being pretty new to being on camera. Mm-hmm. So it's up to me to kind of really, and it becomes very much like a study of just, how, kind of people and how they operate and their all their quirks and features and things like that. And it's not from a very critical, it's not intended to be from a very critical view. It's just that to a certain degree, you have to be somewhat, judgmental isn't the right word, but you have to be aware of all of their, personality traits and quirks and things like that, that make up who they are, so that whether or not there's something that's going to come up during the production that might kind of, stall things or cause a hiccup, or, where in their personality will they shine, and how can we, highlight that best when we get them on camera while we're doing the interview or running through a script with them.
Yeah, and even that, just specifically on that, right, like working with your colleagues and whatnot who maybe aren't so experienced being on camera, and it is kind of a gamble because, like I said, right, like they could be super confident and social butterfly, whatever it be. They're just like they just give off that vibe, but once you put them in front of the camera, it's not there. Yeah. And those are things that like I said, you gamble on, and if you do find those rock stars that are really good on camera, what do? You make a short list, right?
Right. Yeah. And start to mark down those people that are extra special on camera that you can kind of refer to in case you have the opportunity to be a little bit more picky choosy as to who's on camera, because you're like, this person's a rock star, going back to them because we know that sometimes it's like a time, we only have so much time to record this, so let's like go with somebody that we're comfortable with. Yeah. And it's really nice to have that short list of people to work with.
And then, and for me, and to add to that, and I guess it really comes down to what exactly the content is, right? So in the example that we're talking about, using employees is more like whether it's talking about a product or something like that, where it's from like a marketing standpoint where we're trying to get a message out there. For sure. Versus say you're interviewing a customer or a partner or
somebody in a very specific way.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But I guess in the sense of just having a talking head on camera, and the various types of content that you're making, there is that, because you want to give people the opportunities to get comfortable, because there's no way they're going to get good on camera if they don't practice, right?
Oh, for sure.
So I guess depending on the type of content that you want to make, right, you can kind of work with that. So if it's not something that, you know, is going to be a grand video that you're going to be blasting to the entire world, you know, maybe, you know, you can give somebody the opportunity to get in front of the camera and kind of, you know, work out exactly, and then maybe it's just like an internal video or something like that, right? For sure.
It lets you build out that list, right? Because I mean, obviously, in a lot of cases, you never know until you get that person on. You can kind of see where they need to work on things. But yeah, it all, like anything, for the most part, nobody just. I don't think there's any circumstance where people just come out of the gates swinging and they're like pros at something. Yeah. It always takes a little bit of practice and kind of a little bit of effort to make something extra special. So same thing applies to when you have people on camera. You know, it's going to take them a few times before they get that comfort level.
So with that being said, let's kind of follow on that same question of like prepping yourself and working with this. So we were talking about, like, you know, getting colleagues or whoever on camera and to deliver a message. Now in the situation where you're interviewing somebody, what do you do there?
Preparation. Yeah, so there's a few ways that I kind of prepare for that and help individuals who are going to be on camera prepare for that. So again, same thing applies where I'll build up my question list. Typically I like to kind of customize the question list. So if I'm not building out the video directly myself, I'll work with whoever needs to be involved or subject matter experts to kind of give me the hit list of what they need covered within said video. And then from there you can start to build out your question list and kind of refine it. But the more that I'm involved in that process of building out those questions, it helps me prepare and become a little bit more knowledgeable about that subject matter, if I'm not already off the bat kind of thing. So that helps a lot with the preparation side of things. And that's really crucial because that directly applies to the experience for the person that's going to be on camera, your on-camera talent, because if they feel, I think there's a lot of like kind of like small intuition and things like that, and small little tells within somebody's body language or their voice that gives away whether or not they know what they're talking about or not. And I feel that, and I can totally attest to when I was younger, going into a situation where I wasn't as prepared for an interview, and I feel like without being called out on it, I had been called out on circumstances where somebody needed me to kind of refine my question or rephrase my question,
or like and add context,
more context. And because I didn't know enough about the subject matter, I got bit because they were like, I don't know how to answer your question. Can you ask it kind of a different way? And I was like,
yeah, so you're literally reading it off the paper.
Yeah, and I didn't. And you're going like I don't know how to do this. Like I don't know how to ask it. Like I don't.
My producer.
I don't know. Yeah, exactly. And more of that comes from like, you know, a lack of obviously experience mixed with this feeling of being overconfident, and then you walk into a scenario where you're doing a shoot for a customer. Say this is when I worked at a video production agency, and you go into a scenario where you feel like you have the gist of what a company is, until you get into that scenario where something, the question lining is a little bit more specific, and you just don't know enough about that. And you don't know, even in that scenario, you probably, if you knew enough about the industry or with a little bit of like more knowledge, you could have at least, you know, rephrased the question by kind of throwing it at them. It's like, well, you know about this product and You could have kind of like thrown it back at them to kind of wrap their brain around the question and maybe come back to the question. They would have been like, but not having that experience or that knowledge to do so, it really flounders the whole interview.
Yeah, and being prepared for that interview too, right? Yeah. And knowing the content, like you should already know what the answer is.
Totally.
Because at the same time, you know, at the end of the day, you want to know, you're telling the story, and you want to know what that story is. Yeah. And having that preparation and knowing what the answer is, you know, at least for one, you know that you got the answer that you're looking for, because they could, if you don't know the content that you're talking about or interviewing this person on,
how's the video going to be successful?
They could say whatever, and then maybe that's not exactly you know, the soundbite or the piece of information maybe that your producer or whoever it was actually looking for.
For sure.
And then you come back and like, well, no, I was actually looking for this. So
that's a huge factor.
So I think it's very crucial becoming prepared, knowing, you know, having a good, you know, basis around the questions that you want to ask, and, you know, the context there, but at the same time knowing what those answers are as well.
You have the story arc kind of built out in a rough format in your head. You always have to be a little flexible, I think, because unless you're going to directly can an answer and like make somebody just recite it back to you, which generally speaking is a bit of a dud unless they're professionals on camera, you're better off just being somewhat flexible with what the answer could be and have a general idea of what you're looking for. And then generally speaking, you can kind of massage your way through the interview to get to that end goal. Get that question answered and feel like you can check that box off. The other side of preparing for, say, an interview, an on-camera interview with talent is obviously making sure that they're prepared for the shoot, showing them maybe the question list if they feel they need to see it. I feel like we have differing opinions depending on the kind of shoot as to whether or not you should show them the question list or not, because I feel that I've had pretty good success with giving them the question list beforehand so that they can see it. My big thing is like, ideally do not prepare full scripted answers in your head to try and recite back, because you'll stumble and you'll mess up. I also don't want you to like write it down and try and read it like right beside the side of the lens. Anybody that does that, don't do that anymore, because more often than not people can tell that you're looking off to the side of the camera and it looks really amateur. Teleprompter is like what other people kind of go for, and they're like, oh, I'll just read off of a teleprompter. Sometimes if you don't let the production company know that you want a teleprompter, they don't show up with one naturally, mixed with the fact that it takes some effort to be pretty good at reading off a teleprompter, because it's not just like, well, I can read, but with a teleprompter, and this is more for if somebody's watching the video version of this podcast, it's a bit easier to see, but it's kind of like if somebody takes text on a page, obviously, and just starts moving it up on you and revealing fresh text, right? So that's how a teleprompter works, is just text in front of the lens that's reflected on a piece of glass, and that text is constantly moving. So if the text is constantly moving, for example, it's hard, you feel like you're in a race to kind of get through the sentence. So your pace changes and you become more robotic, because you're trying to get to an end goal being the end of that sentence versus showing off your personality and really coming off like a subject matter expert. So it really takes a lot of effort to be good at reading off a teleprompter. People don't realize that until they get in front of it and they're like, oh, that was kind of tricky. The other side of it is that I prefer, if I can, to give people context around the idea of what the video is going to be about, but not give them the question list, because more often, unless there's a specific stat I need them to recite back to me, I won't give them the questions, because I love getting their natural opinion, because more often than not, you're interviewing the individual that is the subject matter expert in their field. So when you go into the interview, you trust that they can, kind of break things down for you in layman's terms enough to make it a presentable format for anybody to kind of watch the video, and not be too kind of high level and too confusing. So I found like my better interviews have come from just giving them the idea of the video and then just doing a cold interview with them. And even if they do feel like, oh, they're kind of like unsure of how to answer something, you can always come back to that question later on once they're a little bit more comfortable with some of the softer questions, so that when they feel like more of a professional and that they're more comfortable, you can come back to that question and like hit them with it again. And suddenly, more often than not, you'll find that they're able to easily answer that question for you. So
and
it's risky though.
And as you said, we kind of think differently, and I don't think we think differently. Like, I don't think it's that severe.
I don't want to fight with you.
I think, and I totally agree with you. You don't want it to be scripted. You want, the person just to come off, genuine, and they're talking from their heart, and like they're being them true selves and being passionate about the subject matter. But at the same time, like my whole belief is at least giving them a heads up on what those questions are. It allows them to collect their thoughts. So not so much writing it down and like memorizing exactly what they're trying to say. It just allows them to, gather the thoughts. So when it does come to that time when they're recording, it helps them, helps lower the amount of ums and ahs and them trying to think, and it just, I just think it makes the recording a little bit more efficient. Maybe like it's not nothing major, and again, it obviously comes down to who that person is and how comfortable they are on camera, right? Because if they're not comfortable at all, then it's obviously going to be, you're dragging this shoot through the mud, just like it's just there's so much more friction opposed to someone who's really good on camera and they can just deliver like exactly what you want.
Yep.
And then also at the same time, it allows them to think their thoughts, but then it can allow them to really kind of shorten and make that answer more concise.
Yes.
So you can get that nice little nugget, that little soundbite, opposed to a run-on where you're just rambling and talking for 5 minutes on this certain thing, and maybe it's like, well, how am I supposed to edit this down to a 20-second answer when the video and the end video duration that you want is 2 minutes, and you also have to work in 5 other questions.
Right. Yeah.
So in something like this, in this format, we're looking at making longer form content. So for us, we can elaborate on our answers and whatnot.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
it depends on the video style. 100%.
It totally does.
Yeah. We're rambling though, so let's carry on. No, I'm kidding.
We're allowed to.
Yeah, that's right.
That being said, so that's, I guess, just talking about, getting ourselves prepped for working with people on camera.
Yeah.
So, and I guess we could use as a perfect segue as, giving the person the questions or not.
Depending on the shoot.
Exactly. So what do you do now that you have the individual in front of you, camera's ready to go?
Yeah.
What types of things do you do to kind of help warm them up, loosen them up so that they're, a little bit more comfortable,
to deliver? Oh, well, there's a few things that you can kind of do. Particularly when it comes to, more specifically when it comes to an interview style video, when they're not doing a scripted read on camera, I like to kind of approach it from the idea, and I learned this from working where I was previously, is that idea is like when I interviewing somebody, I'll start off by saying, listen, it's like, you're the subject matter expert in this field. This is why we have you on camera. More often than that's why we have them on camera. And so I'll say, I want you to approach this interview in the sense of like, we're at a networking event or we're at a bar,
Yeah.
I want you to talk to me in that kind of tone to start with, and we'll refine from there. If we need things to sound more professional, we can kind of tweak it as we go along. But at the very least, that's the tone I want you to start with, I don't want you to overthink it. I just want you to chat. So if I come up to you at a networking event or a conference or a bar, whatever, and we're just like friends and I'm finding out a little bit more about what you do, that's how I want you to answer your questions. If somebody comes up to you and asks what you do for work, you're not gonna be like, I'm all nervous. More often than not, you're gonna be fine. Right? Because you know that you know more about what you do than they know about what you do, right? So there's that comfort factor. You'd hope anyway. Yeah. So most people aren't gonna lie about what they do either, right? So in that circumstance, that's exactly what I want from them.
Yeah.
And when people kind of get into that mindset, it's like, oh, we're having more of a conversation. It's like, yes, this camera's over here kind of thing. Ignore it, it's just you and me chatting.
It's a fly on the wall.
It's a fly on the wall, yeah. It's just you and me chatting. I just want to have a conversation with you.
Yeah.
And more often than not, that generally works pretty good. The next level up is that still people are really nervous and they're just like, and they can't get over that anxiety. Their shoulders are up in their ears because they're just so anxious kind of thing. That's gonna take a little bit more time. So what I do with that as well is that I ask them some kind of preliminary general questions just to get things rolling.
So
before jumping right into the subject matter, I'll ask them some just basic stuff, and I'll just kind of ask them about whatever. It's like maybe I know a little bit about them beforehand, or maybe I'm traveling and I'm doing a shoot somewhere and I can ask them something a little bit more regionally based, right? Maybe there's a sport like a sports event or team that I can see that they're into or something like that. I can ask them about that. Like, oh, the game was on last night. Like, what do you think of blah blah blah?
Yeah.
The more those little bits that seem like kind of like cheesy or funny to do, if you can do it naturally without it being like, so I hear the Rangers last night, blah, blah, blah. The more you can kind of do it off cuff and you're genuinely interested and you show that you're genuinely interested in just having a chat with them, that comfort level just goes woo, and it just kind of, they settle, and then you can just kind of nicely roll into it. Like I said, more often than not, that does the job. The other side of it is, once you got them comfortable, sometimes pacing can be off. And this particularly can be an issue if they're reading off of a script, or if they're reading off of a teleprompter. So memorized, yeah. And particularly if they're memorizing, they have the nugget of what they want to say in their head, and they have the starting point, and then they just go, because they're just trying to like machine gun the line out, right? And be like, get it out to the end, period. And it's on you to kind of make sure that you're kind of studying how they're reading, their pace, their tone, and massage that as the takes go on. So as you do a few more takes of that same line, it's up to you as the director to kind of find where they can change their intonation and where they can make a pause and take a breath that's natural, or emphasize a specific word and take their time. Tell them to kind of take things. It's like, okay, you're reading things as you naturally would, and that's great. Now I want you to sounds funny, but I want you to take things kind of half speed.
Yeah.
And I want you to say the line again. More often than not, people can do that. Not everybody is an absolute 100% success, but you can get people most of the way there with just a few of those tips to kind of get things going.
Yeah.
That's a big factor. The other things, the little tidbit things that I do that are really crucial when you have somebody on camera to kind of loosen them up, is that I'll have times where somebody's a little bit more nervous and they're looking for approval if they're supposed to be looking at the camera and you're off to the side directing, sometimes when they finish up their line, their eyes glance immediately over to you it's almost like a unintentional approval, looking like, was that good kind of thing. Sometimes people are directing, they just look over at the very end of a sentence and they finish their sentence and go, how was that? And you're like, nope, just I need more of I always aim for about a 3-second breath of where they just continue looking on at the camera without anything being said before I cut and go to the next take or next line. That's going to give you your editing space that you need to be able to trim things nicely and piece them together without their eyes wandering or anything, or a funny pause in between, or a funny break in between. So the other side of that is if you're doing an interview and they're supposed to be looking at you and you're off to the side of the camera, so you were standing right beside the camera, so they're looking off to left or right. In the middle of them talking, sometimes people can be thinking and not realizing that they're glancing their eyes, flicking their eyes over to the camera. So it's on your camera operator, if you have one, during that to take note of the fact and kind of mention to you to change things up. So sometimes I'll move out my chair a little bit more, or I'll stand a little bit further away from the camera just slightly, and it doesn't really affect the angle of how they're kind of positioned. Or I'll get the individual that's behind camera to stand more behind me. So there's less focus, less emphasis on the camera and the person standing behind the camera, and more emphasis on my positioning. So those little tips really help a lot, because I'll find that sometimes people that are camera operators, particularly if they're new, sometimes they'll stand kind of beside the camera, which could be problematic. If I'm sitting down, they're standing beside the camera, then the camera's there, and there's a lot of emphasis for the person to look over that way. So sometimes I'll catch it and I'll just very relaxed. The less you can involve the person on camera in terms of the behind the scenes stuff, the more comfortable they're gonna be as well. So don't make it very obviously oh, you keep looking over at the camera, so I really don't want you to do that. The more natural you can be just about telling your camera operator to kind of be just get a little bit more behind the camera kind of thing. Generally, as long as your camera operator kind of knows what you're doing, they're okay with it, and they just kind of go and hide kind of thing. Yeah. And it brings more of the emphasis and attention on you. Yeah. So those little tips are really important. So actually, to kind of segue into little directing tips, if I can, real quick. Speaking along those lines, the other side of things is that, as I mentioned, I want the camera operator telling me that the individual is looking, and not just shouting out in between takes, hey, you're looking at the camera, can you not do that? The reason why, and this is huge, is that this is kind of something that's really, really important to get into, is that particularly if you're gonna be the person that's conducting the interview and running the shoot, it's important that any information that's going on with the production itself gets funneled to you, and if it's pertinent information that you need to share with the individual on camera, it comes from you to them, and not from 3 other people that are on the set.
Exactly, yeah.
The worst thing, so I've had this question come up before with customers of ours, where they've had a really terrible shoot with, they've had a bunch of people on camera, they had a lighting person say, even if they didn't have a lighting person, they just had a camera person and themselves, and they were the director at that shoot. And what they had was these people were getting really worked up, they're having a hard time getting through, and again, maybe it was just a practice thing, they just didn't have enough practice. But I was able to ask the individual, okay, when you were conducting these interviews and you were going through the shoot, were you all giving suggestions? And she said, well, yeah. I said, okay, how many people were behind the camera, running the shoot? And she said, well, there's me. I said, okay, you're the director, yeah. Who else was there? She's like, well, we had a camera person, and we had another person that was just making sure the script was good, but she was helping with lights as well. I said, okay, you were all giving suggestions to the person on camera. And that individual said, yeah. And then I think there was like, the way she dragged her, she was starting to realize what I was getting at.
Yeah.
Because she realized it was like, she knew what I was kind of gonna say next. It was like, imagine if you're that person in front of the camera and you're starting to stumble. In your head, in your own head, you're kind of getting to that point of being like, oh my God, I'm messing up. Like, why do I keep stumbling over the line? You're getting frustrated.
Yeah.
You're uncomfortable, right? You're getting anxious. So imagine that anxiety building by more than one person talking with you, giving you tips on what to do, like at random, rapid fire, right? It's coming at you like shrapnel. It's overload.
Want to be mixed.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. It's always mixed advice. Sometimes people kind of go do. Sometimes you have the director say this, and then the camera person be like, or try this instead. And then there's like this like behind the scenes conflict that doesn't need to be there. It's really important. And in that moment, she realized in this example, she went, oh, like absolutely, that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
Like all the information should always funnel through the director to the person on camera. Try that going forward for anybody listening or watching. I guarantee you it'll improve your productions like by a large margin.
Yeah, and so that example you just gave right there of just funneling all the direction through one person, mainly being the director of the said production.
Yep.
That applies for people who are new and first time on camera to someone who's very experienced, because sure, the person who's more experienced will, maybe clue in a little bit quicker in regards to those directions and maybe be used to it.
Yep.
But yeah, exactly. I think that is a very, good piece of insight to take away from that, just because it can be very overwhelming.
Totally. What's funny about that too is that even when I started, so I started working with you again 4 years ago. And what was funny about when I came in is because before I was in, you were numero uno. You were the only person on the video team here. And so I know what was happening is I kind of discussed with you, and he's like, I said like, these are the things that I've kind of picked up over time. This is what I found worked, and that was one of the things. But I had picked up on when we did our first series of interviews together collectively, which was great because it was kind of working with an old friend again. It was fun to be able to get back into that side of things. I know that for you, even though you were the one doing the camera operation, it was hard for you, I think, to kind of give up the reins of giving suggestion and feedback to the person on camera. So technically, at times, maybe I was the one directing or conducting the interview, but then I know it was hard for you to not get involved and give suggestions as well, because you worked with these people for so long before I did.
Yeah.
So you felt like you knew them enough to like know what needed to be said. But then I think we ran into probably at the same time some times where we probably were both giving advice, or we gave conflicting suggestion. We probably didn't help ourselves. So that even took time to get back into the mode of doing that kind of thing.
Definitely.
So, but it's super crucial. And the way to go about that, obviously, it's like even if you're doing a 2-camera or a 2-person production, you have your director and your camera operator, or your person running all the technical side of things, is that person that is, say, behind the camera, in between questions or whatever, needs to lean over and just kind of mention to you without being loud about it, like, this person's looking over at the camera. Can we try that one again? I just had an audio blip. Even if it's any of those little small things that happen, there's a sound in the background, can we try that again? Doing that in a soft voice without really involving the person on camera is a lot better than being like, yeah, I just had a noise, like, can we do that one again? And you're just being kind of loud and rowdy about it. For most people, that can be a little jarring. So particularly when you're already on camera and you're feeling that bit of anxiety or like extra stress because you're wanting to perform well. So if you're able to funnel all that through to your director, it's going to make that shoot that much more smooth. It's big. Yeah.
So I want to kind of talk on, because I know that was a lot right there in regards to just, getting your on-screen talent prepared.
That's a big factor.
And just getting them ready for recording. So I mentioned at the beginning of this, working with new on-camera talent. I guess let's kind of talk about that there and just, like what should you do when you're working with, I guess, someone who's never been on camera before? Maybe they're not so nervous, but also in the same situation, you're going to have those people who are very nervous. Just so those beginners who want to get on camera, who want to get comfortable and learn these things, just, what are things that, our viewers and listeners can do and what we do to really help these individuals who, are those deers in the headlights, I'm throwing up air quotes for our listeners, who, are just not, really handling it that well and just really trying to dial it down and make them feel comfortable. What's one thing that comes off the top of your head?
Oh, one thing that comes off the top of my head for that, I feel like there's always like a million things.
You want me to hit you with one?
Yeah, sure.
So one thing I notice when you have people who are new on camera is that they will, you kind of touched on it before, they'll try to just rifle right through and just, say it as fast as they possibly can.
Yep.
And what happens is they'll make mistakes, and then rather than taking a pause and they'll just keep going with it.
Yeah.
And being the director, it's upon you to really kind of take control of the situation, opposed to letting them just keep running and trying to nail it. Sure. Allowing them to, because they'll get into this kind of streak of like, they just keep stumbling over this one word, or whatever it is, and they're just like, I can do it. But at the same time, what you just need to do is just, tell them to stop, breathe. Because one, it just allows them to, just calm down, because they're kind of, antsy and just like nervous, antsy. But at the same time, from the editing standpoint, because as you mentioned, you kind of want those buffers in between, because say they're saying the line and they stumble and then, like, oh, I screwed up, and then they just dive right into it. You don't have that window there. Yeah. So being the director during a shoot and you're having an individual who just keeps stumbling and whatnot, that's okay. It's fine. Yeah. Let them, get those out, and just have them take their time, because once they get into that mode, the delivery is going to be fast. Yeah. Everything's it's going to snowball, and you're not going to get what you want.
Yeah, and it's up to the director.
And they'll get agitated and they'll get frustrated, and nothing, as we all know, nothing, works out when you're agitated and frustrated. Yeah. So I'd say that's one tip that I have off the top of my head about working with new talent, is just take control, don't rush the things, and take breaks, take pauses, let them collect their thoughts, and just be calm during these moments.
Yeah, I mean, we've had the flip side of that recently, and I'll touch on that in a second, but it's definitely the idea of like something even as small as just having water. So I feel like I've touched on this before in the past, but not even asking them necessarily they want a water, you just have a water on set near where they're going to be standing or sitting, ready to rock. So they don't even have to think about it. They don't have to step out of frame necessarily. You already have it there, because I think we've all been there probably in a presentation or otherwise, where all of a sudden, like just before you go on to do whatever you're presenting or performing, you have that like dry mouth suddenly happen. You go, whoa, like all the saliva in my mouth is suddenly gone. I can't speak. I'm like, I can't, and then you're focused on that as opposed to focused on what you're supposed to be doing. So if somebody can just be like, oh, water, like in between takes, and it's just like right there, it just makes it that much more of a thing. And the more that you look prepared that way, the more comfortable that person's like, oh, you thought of that, that's really nice. I think that really helps as well. Again, it comes back to like reiterating sometimes the point is like, listen, remember how I said about the thing about, we're in a bar? I want you to channel that, right? It's like, you know more about this than I do. And sometimes it's like self-deprecating. You'd be like, maybe you know a lot about the subject matter. And you'd be like, listen, if you're speaking with a subject matter expert, particularly on camera, you're like, you know way more about this than I do. I'll admit it, like, you know it, like, so I want you to fill me in. I want you to talk to me as though I know nothing about it, and then we'll kind of build things up from there. And oftentimes that helps kind of build that confidence. Like, you know what, like I have been doing, however long they've been doing their job, or they've been in a position or had some experience, right? Yeah. It's like maybe you're doing an interview about like just an individual and telling their story. It's like, I wasn't there, so I need you to fill me in, give me the details, run me through it. And then sometimes it's like, once you let them do like a full run of something and it's kind of long, then you can go like, I want to go back, right? Exactly. It's up to you as a director to be able to. That's an important factor as well, is this is a big note as well, is the idea of being able to kind of multitask. So not only are you the one kind of like keeping the pace and keeping the feeling and vibe of the the production in check. You're making sure that nobody's getting too anxious or stressed out. It's on you to also be able to multitask and edit in your head. So it's up to you to kind of, if you have a question list, when somebody's answering, you're kind of making mental notes of the less that you're writing down and look like a psychiatrist, the better, I find. But the more mental notes you're able to make, like, oh, that was a really good bit, like I really like that, that's gonna be perfect. And so that you know that you've nailed that answer, or the opposite could be like, oh, they kind of touched on this and then they kind of fell off. So that you're able to, once they finish their answer, you can either ask a follow-up, or you can come back to it later on in the interview and be like, I want to touch back on this, da-da-da-da-da-da. And then your ability to kind of like be able to be like, okay, I want to like go further or deeper into this subject, makes people be like, oh, this is more of a conversation, less of like a one question, one answer, one question, one answer, and it feels just kind of disjointed, right? Depending on how you've built out your question list. The more natural you can kind of make that and ask follow-up and kind of do that whole flow, it makes it that much more normal of a conversation to be having on camera, right? So I find that really helps as well.
Yeah, and even in the point that you were making before about, like that initial question, whether it's an interview or whether it is a message that you're recording for whatever scripted style video that you're making. Generally, in most situations with new people on camera, that first few takes, is generally, it's rough, right? Yeah. So to the point that you're making is, just maybe to make them feel like, they're not constantly screwing up and, they just feel like they're not getting anywhere. Yeah, maybe keep moving forward with the stuff because, they have that kind of sense of, oh, maybe things are, and again, it helps loosen them up and helps them feel more comfortable. And the more and more time that they're on camera and talking to the camera and delivering whatever content they're delivering, they're just naturally going to become more comfortable.
For sure.
Especially if the director, us, you, are being, friendly and easygoing with them.
Patient.
They're going to, exactly, patience. That is word of the day right there. We will call that, right there.
Ban that on the video.
Just flash it, pew, pew, pew. So if you can maintain that kind of environment with them and just keep the production moving along, they'll kind of find the groove or the stride, and then maybe those initial questions, those first questions, or the introduction to the video, which is pretty key to the video because that's the first instance that people are going to see, obviously, when they click play because it's the beginning of the video. Yeah. And in my opinion, I'm sure you agree, that's something that you want to make sure you have something that's pretty rock solid.
Yeah, locked down.
So, come, and that's where you kind of come and be like, you know what? And you just phrase it and just say it to them. Be like, you've really, have found your stride and you've become more comfortable in front of the camera. Maybe let's, go back and do the intro bit one more time.
Totally.
And, we've talked about in other episodes about just, doing countless takes.
Yes.
Don't just,
don't do one and
do one take and be like, yeah, we're good. Let's move on to the next. Obviously, do multiple. Yeah. And especially in the situation, because if you know what your content that you're producing, maybe those bits you're not exactly using, so maybe it is a product video, or even if it is an interview and there's B-roll.
Yes.
If you're thinking about the entire edit in your head, as you alluded to, you can maybe even think about areas of like, all right, this first part, they nailed.
Yeah.
And that second part isn't, but if you did it in multiple takes and you're like, well, this is obviously something we can put with B-roll over, you can take those sections from those multiple takes and just stitch them together.
Yeah, because you've done the mental editing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, as long as you're aware of what's being said and, as you said, the mental editing, you can work with that and, again, keep the production going and just keeping it as easy as possible for the talent, because you don't want them to get frustrated and you don't want them to feel, they're not succeeding, because at the end of the day, it's just going to dwell on them and it will cause them to get, agitated. And as I mentioned earlier, that's just not going to help at the end of the day.
That's right. Yep.
So I'd say that's like that. Those are some tips, working with on-screen talent who are new. People who are you know, who are really good on camera. Like, I wouldn't say there's any specific tips in regards to that, because it's the same type of stuff. You still want to, you know, keep the environment easy. You still want to funnel all the directions through one person. Yeah. You know, it's just for that person who is really good delivering on camera. It's just, if you keep all these principles in place, it's just going to make that shoot so much faster, right?
The only thing you have to make sure of is, like, if you have somebody that's really good at presenting or being on camera and they're doing their thing, it's just depending on the video that you're making, maybe you have to tweak their personality a bit to better be in line with other brand versus their personality or something like that. Yeah. So sometimes you have to tweak necessarily. Maybe they're a little overly explosive or excited.
So that's exactly what I was going to get at, is that, you know, you have the people who are new and uncomfortable in front of the camera. Mm-hmm. Then you have the people who are just, you know, rock stars, that's ideally who you want to work with. Whether those are colleagues that we've mentioned, you've put on that short list and worked with numerous times. Yeah. But then maybe you do have those individuals who are so used to being on stage and presenting, and they need to kind of bring that, you know, that excitement and, you know, over the top enthusiasm, where maybe, you know, for the camera, it's not exactly what you're looking for, so you want to kind of dial that back. Yeah. So that's kind of what I want to quickly touch on there too, is like what things you can do to, you know, pull back on that enthusiasm.
Yeah, I find that in those circumstances, you have people, again, that maybe they're really good at doing keynote speeches or something because they have something very unique or quirky about their personality, and they're just explosive, right? Mm-hmm. So they can be in a room in front of 1,000 people or more or whatever, and they just own the room, right? Because they're just reaching out to everybody, and they're just like over the top, and they're just like an entertaining human, right? If you get them in front of camera and they're still doing that shtick and can be like, whoa, like, all right, we know, dial it back a little bit here. Generally speaking, more or less, most people that are kind of pros at presenting are able to kind of make that switch and kind of dial it back. But sometimes you do have to be like, okay, I love what you're doing. This is great. I still want your personality. I just want it a little bit tamer. So let's take it 10% down on either volume or just kind of tone, and maybe just, speed. Any of those little things. It could be a series of those things or a combination or whatever. But if you're aware of kind of like, you know, this is a little too much, depending on what I'm trying to get them to say on camera, you can make those little tweaks to kind of dial it back a little bit. And there's nothing wrong with getting their personality on camera and then locking that in as an option, but then being like, okay, I want to see this as an alternate too. Yeah. And generally speaking, because they're pretty good with this kind of thing, they're able to make that change and give you what you want.
And that's the thing too, is and just letting them know, like, because ideally you want, you know, the delivery to be conversational. You want them to be true and genuine. Yep. You don't want them to come off fake. You just want them to come off as themselves. And you know, in my experiences working with those individuals, it's just being like, yeah, like, your excitement's great, but as you said, just dial it back, you know, and just tell them, like, let's keep it conversational. Yep. You know, you're not presenting to a room full of people, you're talking to me. Yes. You know, because that right there, because it's kind of a little overwhelming if I was being all like, hey, wow, I got something great for you, and I was just literally talking to you. Yeah. that's a little bizarre. Yeah. So, you know, just, and it's just being straight up with them. Obviously, you don't want to be an asshole about it. You just want to just tell them straight up, like, hey, you're doing great. You know, you're nailing it, but let's just dial it back.
Yeah. 10% lower on volume, tone, speed, and without having to be like, I like your personality, I just want less of your personality. If you say those like more specific things, they're like, okay, and then they feel a little less personally offended by you being like, don't do you, you know? So
I think that helps.
Yeah, so lastly, before we wrap this up, I just want to kind of touch on, you know, just a couple experiences that we've had, you know, that do impact the on-screen talent. Just recently, you know, we had an instance where we were filming in the office, and there was a lot of things happening around, and what was happening, it was mainly audio issues, because obviously we want to make sure that the only audio that we're recording was our on-screen talents. But what was happening was there was just so much things happening, and especially from the audio perspective, that was just interrupting. And what literally could have taken us 30 minutes to record the whole thing, maybe I'm exaggerating, maybe 30 minutes to an hour. it took us 2.5 hours because there's so many interruptions, and it ultimately affected our on-screen talent because she wasn't able to, you know, find her groove and hit her stride, because she would be delivering, you know, because we like to do multiple takes, you know, she would do one good take and it's like, all right, you know, you nailed it, let's do another one.
Yeah.
And then as she's about to do that, then there's a disturbance and she stops, and now we have to wait, you know, a couple minutes, and it just threw her off. And yeah, and it just ultimately turned that shoot into a much longer shoot, and then it actually ended up having us have to reshoot the whole thing.
Right.
So I guess the lesson there is to really make sure that when you're recording people on camera, I guess depending on the content, because I guess if you're interviewing someone and you're on a show floor, it just kind of,
It's par for the course.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But in the situation where, and I guess I didn't touch on it, but for that specific shoot, it was a video that we were trying to get a message out. It was a promo piece that we were doing. But anyways, in that specific situation, you know, you want to make sure that you have a controlled environment, whether it's from an audio disturbance or even just other things that can cause
distraction.
Yes, exactly. So you want to make sure that, you know, your on-screen talent can, you know, dial it in and, you know, focus on what they have to do, because at the end of the day, if they're being pulled out and not able to find that groove or that stride,
I know you're getting frustrated.
And yes, and that
I know you're getting upset because it was like, this is getting outrageous, because every time we went to do a good take and it was almost a good take, we'd have, really what the situation was, we shot in a new space at the office that we didn't typically shoot in, and so we didn't realize the amount of noise pollution that would necessarily be involved. It was otherwise a quiet floor, but that doesn't mean that the sounds above us were going to be as quiet, and they certainly weren't. It was a pretty active floor when we were shooting, which meant that we had a lot of noise pollution of like banging and slamming and creaking and cracking, because it's an older building, so there's lots of floor creaking. It was just chaos. So I know that was frustrating, and it was a good practice in trying to get into that Zen mode, right? Because if we're getting frustrated behind camera, obviously, what do you think that's going to project onto the person in front of the camera? Particularly for somebody that was fairly new to being on camera, right? So
yeah, that was what, her second time on
second
camera?
time probably, yeah. Like being on like on a large production versus just like presenting like to one camera on our own. Yeah. So lots of good lessons learned. Definitely in terms of our space too. It's like, well, we're never going to shoot there again. So.
Is there any experiences that you've had, maybe, you know, with me that I'm just not recalling on?
Are we having like a confessional? Have there been times when I've been bad, Matt? Or have there been times when you've been upset with me?
No. No. I'm just saying, has there been times that, you know, you've experienced working with on-screen talent? Because I know John from Arc Media, a partner and friend of ours, he was telling us that he actually had to rig up. Now, I don't want to speak exactly, I'm just trying to recall exactly what he rigged up. But I remember he was telling us he had somebody on, that he was interviewing, and they were so nervous in front of the camera that what he actually did is he rigged up, so it was basically a teleprompter, but rather than it being the script or whatever, the questions, whatever it be that the person on camera was seeing, what he did was he set up an iPad and ran FaceTime to it so that the prompter reflected his face, because the idea was that the on-screen talent was talking to the camera and answering these questions.
But was so nervous about looking at the camera.
Was so nervous and he couldn't do it. So what John did was that he took the iPad and did a FaceTime so that the prompter was reflecting his face, and so that the on-screen talent was talking to him opposed to talking to the camera.
That's an intense example.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's.
But that right there is like credit to him to even think of that.
That's nimble thinking. Yeah, that's thinking on the fly and hoping that something works. That's like at the very tip of desperation and trying to make sure that a production goes okay. But it worked.
Yeah, and it just shows you like the things that you have to do to make sure that your on-camera talent is comfortable and can get through and deliver the content that you're looking for.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you're put in those situations where it's like, we need this specific individual on camera, and maybe that person is not good on camera. You have to just embrace that, right?
Yeah, I've had people, particularly from my prior experiences beyond working here, where I've worked with people that are in fairly vulnerable sectors or working with vulnerable people, where I have to interview said vulnerable people, whether it's kids or people that have had, you know, tough stories that I'm trying to get on camera. More often than not, those people are going to be coming with a decent amount of, you know, stress and anxiety over having to recall a circumstance or something like that. So I've had times where I've really had to kind of break down bit by bit everything that I kind of want out of, you know, this interview. And it takes a lot to, one, be patient, obviously, enough to be able to be flexible in that way, but I'm not kind of trying to pat myself on the back, but I was pretty proud of those end results, because it was definitely a test of my ability to kind of get something out of a very tough situation. So you're working with somebody that's very anxious, they're having a hard time telling their story in the first place. It can kind of sometimes elongate your shoot in a very large way. So I've had circumstances where it's like, you know, I've had 40 minutes to interview somebody and it ended up being an hour and a half, but it was a really good hour and a half, because instead of, you know, again, going back to something I talked about earlier, instead of just sticking to like my scripted questions, I ended up just kind of like having a general chat with them. And through that conversation of just kind of talking to them, and just going, screw the questions for now, I'm throwing those to the side, we're just gonna talk. Just talk to me. And then sometimes I've even been able to identify with some of my experiences or something like that, or anecdotes of my own, that I can kind of level with them a little bit. And in those moments, that kind of allows them to open up, right? And what started off as like a very intense, super stressful experience became something that was actually really beneficial for both of us, because it was a great learning lesson for me. And they actually walked away. I've had good instances where at the end of those interviews where they ran on really long, but we ended up just being able to connect more than really do this strict interview. You know, they walk away being like, you know, I came in like really scared, didn't really want to do this. I was felt like kind of pressured to do this by whoever asked me to be a part of it, but you know, I walk away feeling like I'm really glad I did that kind of thing, and it was great chatting, and then you kind of have follow-up correspondence with them, and you kind of make a friend out of it. So I've had other instances again where I've produced in the past videos for an adoption agency in town where we are, and I had circumstances where I was working with children that were in pretty tough situations where they had been passed over multiple rounds of being adopted. So I was going in to create video profiles on these kids to act as almost like another step in the process before they met with a potential family, because they had circumstances where they were so close to being adopted, and when the family or the potential parents came to meet them, they found that there was something that they just couldn't work with, and then they pulled out of the adoption process with that child, in very basic terms, obviously. But so these kids were kind of like already gone through traumatic experiences, and they were kind of hit with like these doses of being kind of like denied a family again, just because of whatever their vulnerable state was and their complications were that they potentially that they had, and they needed a family. So I had instances where I had a child that was virtually nonverbal have to kind of run an audio interview with them, and that's how we generally conducted it. I just put an audio recorder down and I covered B-roll over top of the video of them playing and having fun, kind of thing. We set up days for them to just go and like have experiences that they didn't get to have, that to kind of show some of their personality off and really show who they were. So I had instances where I'm working with kids that are nonverbal, but I have to have some kind of underlying, you know, kind of narrative to share about this child. So it definitely tested my limits, but I mean, at the end of the day, I've been pretty happy to like see what's come out of it. And those are hard. Those are really hard, because I've had circumstances where, you know, the kids don't know what I'm doing exactly, or they kind of like, they think I'm gonna be maybe adopting them or something like that. And it's been like really tricky. So that was like the peak of my ability to kind of rein things back in, knowing that I have a job to do, but also being able to level and identify with the person I have that I'm featuring and make them feel good about what they're doing, and ended up like making friends with these kids and stuff like that. And obviously the videos ended up doing well. They all got adopted for each one that I made, so that was a really good end result.
Yeah.
So when you get that end result, that you get the news that they have been adopted, you're like, right on. But you know, it came from very tough circumstances to start with. So those were the peak of my limits, where you have those tough moments that you're like, I don't know how I'm gonna get through this day. And I have a full day of just in my head going like, how am I gonna do this? How am I gonna do this? How am I gonna do this? And the more human you can be at the end of the day, and the less robotic and the less strict, the better the end result will be.
Yeah, but then also, what you said right there, like, that's awesome that you're able to do that. Yeah. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, you're gonna have those situations which we both have had, and maybe our viewers and listeners may run into, is you're gonna be interviewing an individual who, is the head of the company, or the prime minister of the country, or the whatever, just someone who's super
high
level and has a very, very, very tight window.
Oh yeah.
It really, it makes the situation stressful, and it also, gives you very, very little wiggle room.
Yeah, I've had circumstances where I've started off as 30 minutes with a high-level executive, or anybody in those very large, intense roles.
Yeah.
Break down to, we have 5 minutes with them.
Yeah.
And when they show up, they say, I have less than 5 minutes. Can we get this done now?
And that's the thing, is, and in those situations, right, you just gotta, it is what it is, you just embrace it and you do the best you can.
Yep.
At the end of the day, like, it comes, like, you as long as you're doing the best that you can, and you're ready to go, your camera's set up, you get them mic'd up, and it's like, all right, work with them, because to your point, or your example, I only have 5 minutes, and they're like, all right, great, okay, then let's do this, keeping that morale positive, and staying positive, even though inside you're just like, oh my God, this is super stressful, and most of those times that individual vibe that they're giving off is not the most
intense.
But then once you hit record, this super happy, energetic, like, I'm your best friend, comes, and it's just like, okay, and 9 times out of 10, those individuals know how to put on that persona for the camera, and so it doesn't require much direction. It's just being prepared and just, I guess, being on your toes, and because again, you're not going to have much direction to give them, because they'll have their own team and staff that's telling them, like, this is what you're doing, and it's like, and if anything, you're going to be working with those individuals, but again, with those individuals at that level of seniority, whether it's in the company or whatever they are, your window of, or input of direction is very, very, very small, and you just embrace it and just work with what you can do.
I had a full question list, for example. This was several years ago now, and I was doing a shoot. We're located in Canada, but I had a shoot in the US, and so we had an instance where this is a wild shoot, so I had 3 days of shooting. So on day 1, I got most of what I needed, thinking that day 2 was going to be a breeze then. Day 2, I had a power outage in the area, in the facility that I was doing my shoot in, for the big chunk of the day. So then that meant I was backlogged. So we ended up finishing up the shoot way late, knowing that we had a drive to do for 5 hours to get into the next state over to do a half-hour interview with the executive, like the owner of the company, which was the next state over. So it was about a 5-hour drive. And so what ended up happening is that we finished up the shoot late at night on day 2 because we had that power outage, and we ended up just staying in a motel, myself and the other guy I was traveling with, and then we drove early the next morning to get into the next state over. And when I showed up a good hour and a half before, because we just wanted to be early, and we were told as time kind of went on that we had less and less time, for example, with this individual. And so at the end of it, we had less than 5 minutes with that person. And he comes in like a bull in a china shop, being like, all right, like, give me the mic, puts it on, and he's like, what are we saying? What am I supposed to say? I had a whole question list, and it was on me to like edit my 10 question list down to like 2 or 3. and just be like, all right, I need you to rifle these things off. Thankfully, he was able to kind of just be like, bang, bang, bang.
Yeah.
Like, after all, he's the owner of the company. But I was pretty glad that it wasn't a circumstance where he was nervous, because if he was nervous, like that wasn't gonna happen. So I was pretty lucky there, but it felt like a pretty intense example of like, we were already like stretching our shoot by having to do the silly like it was like tacked on to do a 5-hour drive there and back, and then I had a 11-hour drive home that same day. So doing all that, plus the intensity, plus like the limited window to get what I really wanted to get was like, but it was a learning lesson. I learned a lot from that, but you'll find that a lot in those circumstances. So being able to be flexible and just kind of go with the flow was huge.
Yeah. And
Big.
yeah. So I think that, we'll just end it on that note. That kind of wraps up, kind of our experiences and our tips for you guys when it comes to the varying degrees of experience of on-screen talent. And yeah, so I would take that and, because you're gonna have those individuals that are new but want to, flourish and be those rock stars when it comes to on-camera talent, and you need to, feed that appetite and give them those opportunities. So it just comes to you as the director, the video producer, to think creatively there and figure out where you can kind of place these individuals who are new and allow them to kind of bloom and become these on-camera rock stars. And then, as we kind of alluded to before, when you do have those individuals that are really good, make that short list and keep that to the side. So in those situations where you're like, all right, we need to make a video, who do I work with? Oh, I got these awesome people right here. Or if you're even in the situation that you're interviewing someone and you have someone who's just really good on camera, that's awesome, that's great, and you just kind of work with it. It makes things so much easier.
Essentially, at the end of the day, if you want to like start off being a good director, knowledge about the subject that you're doing the video about, patience, the ability to kind of go with the flow on set and kind of manage change, but also multitask. Those kind of 4 things to start with are gonna really help you at a launching point of being a good director. And being the boss at the end of the day. You cannot be the boss if you don't have those other things in play. So if you're not the subject matter, if you're not up on the subject matter, you're not patient, or you need to work on your patience, you're not able to kind of like wrangle everybody in, then you cannot be the boss. Therefore, you're not quite there yet to be a director. So make sure that you kind of practice up. Start small, work your way up from there, and you'll be a hit.
Yep. Alrighty, well, that wraps up this episode. Thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching this episode of the Video Island podcast, brought to you by Vidyard. You can subscribe to the audio version on your favorite podcast platform or check out more videos here.